I didn't even realize something was wrong until I followed the dirt tracks one morning and saw fresh asphalt cutting straight through land I had owned for over a decade. The property wasn't small, and it definitely wasn't forgotten. I'd purchased it years earlier under a holding company after a long negotiation, partly because it bordered a growing residential area. At the time, the land was quiet, trees, uneven terrain, and a natural slope that made it unsuitable for quick development. Or so I thought. What I didn't know back then was that the nearby homeowners association had been quietly expanding, inch by inch, waiting for an opportunity they believed would never be challenged. The first sign came with noise. Heavy equipment, engines idling, warning beeps echoing across the land. When I drove closer, I saw survey stakes, orange tape, and a partially paved access road cutting directly across my parcel. Not around it, not near it. Through it, clean, deliberate, and confident, as if permission had already been granted. I confronted the site's supervisor immediately. He wasn't rude. In fact, he seemed almost bored. He told me the HOA had approved the access road months ago and that everything was handled. When I told him he was standing on private land, he simply shrugged and said, "You'll have to talk to the association." That conversation didn't go the way you'd expect. Instead of apologies or confusion, I was met with cold certainty. The HOA representative claimed they had a prescriptive right to the road. They said residents needed emergency access, deliveries, and a secondary exit. According to them, the road was necessary, and my land was in the way. I reminded them I had never granted an easement, never signed a document, never even been contacted. Their response was sharp and dismissive. They insisted construction would continue and advised me to resolve it legally if I disagreed. Days later, the situation escalated fast. I received a formal notice accusing me of interfering with community infrastructure. Then came the lawsuit. The HOA wasn't just defending their road, they were suing me for damages, delays, and alleged obstruction. The irony was staggering. They built first, asked nothing, and now wanted the court to pressure me into surrender. That's when I stopped arguing and started reviewing records. Deeds, old plats, county filings most people never bother to read. Because if they were this confident, I needed to understand exactly what they thought they knew and what they had completely missed. They believed the road made them powerful, but one overlooked detail was about to flip everything upside down. The moment I opened the county archive files, I realized the HOA hadn't just crossed my land. They'd crossed a legal line they couldn't come back from. Most people assume land ownership is simple. You buy it, you fence it, you pay taxes, and that's that. But real control lives in paperwork buried decades deep, and that's where I went next. I pulled plats going back 30 years, tracing parcel splits, abandoned proposals, and filings that never made it into the HOA's glossy welcome packets. What I found wasn't obvious, but it was devastating. The road they built wasn't an upgrade. It wasn't a shared access point. It was a shortcut designed to save money. The association had planned an alternative route years earlier, but it required purchasing additional land and dealing with environmental permits. Instead, someone quietly decided my property was the easier option. No negotiation, no easement, just construction, and here's where it got worse for them. The HOA's lawsuit claimed they had long-standing access rights. That statement alone told me they were bluffing. Prescriptive rights require uninterrupted, open use over many years. Their road had existed for less than 6 months. Before that, there was nothing but dirt and brush. No maintenance records, no utility lines, no proof. I hired a land use attorney, not to threaten, but to verify. Within a week, he confirmed it. Not only did the HOA lack an easement, but the road itself violated zoning setbacks and crossed into a protected buffer zone tied to my parcel. They hadn't just trespassed, they'd exposed themselves to regulatory fines. Meanwhile, construction continued. Asphalt cured, signs went up. Residents began using the road daily, unaware they were driving across land that wasn't legally accessible. And the HOA leaned into it. They filed motions demanding I allow continued use for community safety. They painted me as unreasonable, obstructive, greedy. That narrative almost worked until we responded. Instead of asking the court to stop the road, my legal team filed a countersuit. Not emotional, not aggressive, surgical. We documented every violation, every unauthorized decision, every email that showed they knew permission hadn't been granted. We included damages for land alteration, loss of use, and environmental impact. The numbers weren't small. The HOA's tone changed immediately. Meetings were postponed. Emails slowed. Their confidence cracked. Because once the court understood this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a calculated risk, they were no longer the plaintiffs with leverage. They were defendants trying to explain why they built first and sued later. But the real shock wasn't just that the road was illegal. It was who actually held the deeper leverage beneath it. Just when the HOA thought the road was their biggest problem, a deeper discovery turned their entire case into a liability they couldn't outrun. As the countersuit moved forward, my attorney suggested expanding the title search beyond my single parcel. At first, it sounded unnecessary. The dispute was about a road, nothing more. But land disputes are rarely isolated, and HOAs often rely on assumptions layered over decades. Assumptions are dangerous when documents don't agree. We widened the search to include the surrounding tracts that had once been part of a larger estate before the neighborhood was developed. That's when a forgotten filing surfaced, an old transfer agreement attached to a dissolved development entity. Buried in the fine print was a clause most people would never notice, a reversionary interest tied to infrastructure access. In simple terms, the developer who originally built the neighborhood never fully conveyed certain access rights to the HOA. Those rights were contingent on conditions that were never completed. When the developer dissolved, those interests didn't vanish. They followed the chain of title, and that chain led back to me, not just to my land, but to the very corridor the HOA relied on for secondary access, utilities, and emergency routing. The road they built crossed my parcel, but the authority they claimed to manage it was never legally theirs. They'd been operating on inherited assumptions, not enforceable rights. When this information was introduced during a preliminary hearing, the reaction was immediate. The HOA's legal team asked for a recess. The judge asked pointed questions. The room shifted. Because now the issue wasn't whether they could keep the road. It was whether they had standing to enforce anything related to it at all. Behind closed doors, things unraveled fast. Internal HOA emails disclosed during discovery showed board members had been warned years earlier about unclear land control. Those warnings were ignored, shortcuts were taken, votes were rushed, and now every decision tied to that access route was under scrutiny. Residents started asking questions. Why were legal fees climbing? Why was the road suddenly controversial? Why were board meetings going private? The HOA tried to keep it contained, but information has a way of leaking when pressure builds. What started as a road dispute had become something much larger. The association wasn't just defending construction, they were defending their authority. And the more documents surfaced, the harder that became. Because if the HOA didn't actually control the land they regulated, Then their fines, rules, and enforcement actions rested on unstable ground. And once that realization reached the court, the balance of power began shifting in ways the HOA never anticipated. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter when the judge asked a single question the HOA couldn't answer clearly. Up until that moment, the association had relied on confidence. They spoke in firm language, referenced policies, and acted as if their authority was unquestionable. But authority means nothing without ownership, or at least lawful control. And now that was exactly what was being challenged. During the hearing, my attorney presented a simple timeline: when the neighborhood was approved, when access rights were supposed to be finalized, when they were never recorded. The documents were clean, certified, and difficult to dispute. The HOA's counsel tried to pivot, arguing community reliance and public safety. But those arguments require a legal foundation. They didn't have one. The judge asked whether the HOA possessed a recorded easement granting them the right to construct and maintain the road across my land. The room stalled. They referenced internal approvals, emergency needs, and historical usage, but no recorded easement, no signed grant, no consent. That absence changed everything. The court issued a temporary order halting further construction and restricting enforcement actions related to the road. Residents could still pass through for the moment, but the HOA was prohibited from expanding, modifying, or asserting ownership over the access route. Behind the scenes, the fallout was immediate. Contractors paused work. Insurance carriers requested explanations. The HOA's legal expenses doubled almost overnight. And worst of all for them, the countersuit gained momentum. Because now we weren't just talking about unauthorized construction, we were talking about misrepresentation of authority. Discovery expanded, financial records were requested. Board meeting minutes were reviewed line by line. What surfaced wasn't malicious, but it was careless. Decisions made quickly, warnings dismissed. Legal reviews skipped to save time and money. Meanwhile, residents were growing uneasy. Notices stopped coming, fines were quietly withdrawn, enforcement letters disappeared. The HOA that once acted with confidence suddenly became cautious, almost invisible. That silence spoke louder than any announcement. My position never changed. I didn't block access. I didn't retaliate. I let the process unfold. Because the more the HOA tried to justify its actions, the clearer the truth became. They had built something they didn't own, enforced rules they couldn't support, and sued someone who had the paperwork to prove it. And the court was paying attention. But the real turning point came when the countersuit reached a provision the HOA had never imagined being enforced. The moment our countersuit invoked a clause the HOA had overlooked for decades, their legal strategy collapsed almost overnight. Buried deep within the original development framework was a governance provision most residents, and clearly most board members, had never read. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but it was precise. The clause stated that if the association exercised control over land or infrastructure it did not legally own or hold rights to, any affected landowner could seek corrective oversight, including administrative intervention. In simpler terms, if the HOA acted like it owned something it didn't, the court could step in and limit, or restructure, their authority. When this provision was introduced, the HOA's attorneys requested time to review. That request alone said everything. They hadn't prepared for this angle because they didn't know it existed. And once they did, the consequences became impossible to ignore. The association attempted to settle quietly. Their first proposal was modest: mutual dismissal, no damages, and a retroactive easement offer. It sounded reasonable on paper, but it ignored the damage already done. My land had been altered. My rights had been challenged publicly. And more importantly, the HOA had demonstrated a pattern of acting first and justifying later. We declined. As hearings continued, testimony revealed how decisions were made internally. Votes were passed without full disclosure. Legal opinions were summarized instead of shared. Risk assessments were ignored if they delayed construction. None of it was illegal on its own, but together, it painted a picture of an organization operating beyond its comfort zone. The judge didn't issue a dramatic ruling. Instead, the court ordered an independent review of the HOA's authority related to access, enforcement, and land use. That review froze multiple association actions. Fines unrelated to the road were paused. New projects were delayed. The HOA's control began shrinking, not because of punishment, but because oversight had arrived. Residents noticed immediately. Suddenly, approvals required external confirmation. Notices were softened. The board stopped acting unilaterally. What had once felt like a rigid governing body now felt uncertain. All of this stemmed from one decision: building a road where permission was never granted. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The HOA had sued to assert control, only to trigger the very process that questioned whether they should hold that control at all. What followed wasn't a dramatic courtroom win, but a shift so complete that the HOA never fully recovered from it. By the time the independent review began, the HOA wasn't defending a road anymore. They were defending their right to govern at all. The appointed reviewer didn't rush. That alone unsettled the association. HOAs are used to speed, deadlines, and quiet compliance. This process was the opposite. Requests were detailed, deadlines were extended. Every assumption was questioned. The reviewer asked for original authority documents, enforcement justifications, and proof of jurisdiction over shared infrastructure. What the HOA submitted revealed the problem clearly. Their power wasn't rooted in ownership. It was rooted in habit. Over the years, no one had challenged them, so procedures hardened into rules. Fines were issued because they always had been. Roads were approved because no one said no. Until now. The review concluded that while the HOA could manage internal matters, its authority over external access and land-adjacent infrastructure was conditional, and those conditions had never been satisfied. The road was the most visible violation, but it wasn't the only one. Based on those findings, the court issued a corrective order. The HOA retained basic operational control, but oversight was imposed on land use decisions. Any enforcement tied to access, boundaries, or shared corridors now required external validation. In practical terms, the HOA lost unilateral power. The reaction inside the community was immediate. Board members resigned quietly. Meetings became sparsely attended. Residents who once feared fines started asking questions, and the association's legal expenses, now public, sparked frustration. People wanted to know how a single road had caused so much damage. Behind closed doors, the HOA tried to stabilize. They proposed revised bylaws. They sought mediation. They floated the idea of buying the land outright. But every option cost more than they expected, financially and reputationally. Meanwhile, my role remained passive. I didn't campaign. I didn't demand control. I simply enforced my rights and let the process do what it was designed to do. That restraint mattered. It framed the outcome not as retaliation, but correction. The road was eventually restricted, then redesigned. Access was rerouted under supervised agreements. What remained was an HOA fundamentally changed, more cautious, more limited, and no longer unchecked. All because one shortcut had exposed a foundation that wasn't as solid as anyone believed. And just when it seemed the conflict was winding down, an unexpected proposal shifted the balance one final time. The proposal arrived quietly, without threats or legal language, but it carried more weight than every motion filed before it. After months of review, oversight, and restricted authority, the HOA approached my legal team with a different tone. There was no confidence this time, no assumptions, just a request to talk. What they offered wasn't a settlement in the traditional sense. It was a structural change. They proposed transferring administrative control of the disputed access corridor and related infrastructure to a neutral entity. On paper, it sounded like compromise. In reality, it was an admission. The HOA no longer trusted itself to manage land use decisions without risk, and the court's involvement had made that clear. But the proposal went further. To resolve ongoing exposure and restore stability, the association suggested reconstituting its governance framework, placing certain decision-making powers under external supervision, and restructuring the board's authority. It was drastic, and it wasn't something they would have considered before the road. The reason was simple: liability. Every action they took without clear authority now carried consequences. Insurance premiums had risen. Vendors demanded indemnification, and residents were increasingly vocal about transparency. The HOA needed a reset. We reviewed the proposal carefully, not because we were eager to control anything, but because the offer acknowledged something important. Power had shifted. The association was no longer dictating terms. They were responding to reality. The court didn't approve the proposal outright. Instead, it asked for revisions, safeguards, and resident input. That process took time, and during it, the HOA operated under limitations that reshaped daily operations. Enforcement slowed. Discretion replaced rigidity. The culture changed. Residents noticed the difference. Some welcomed it. Others resisted. But the era of unquestioned authority was over. The road that sparked everything had been partially decommissioned, and its replacement followed a legally sound route approved through oversight. What remained was a lesson few HOAs ever learn. Authority isn't permanent. It depends on compliance, clarity, and restraint. Lose one, and the rest can unravel quickly. When the revised framework was finally approved, it didn't name winners or losers. It corrected a system that had overreached, and in doing so, it ensured the same mistake couldn't happen again, at least not quietly. But the most lasting impact wasn't written into the agreement. It was felt in how the HOA now behaved every single day. Long after the paperwork was finalized, the real consequences revealed themselves in ways no court order could fully capture. With the new governance framework in place, the HOA resumed operations, but it wasn't the same organization anymore. Decisions that once took minutes now took weeks. Legal reviews became standard. External approvals were required for anything touching land, access, or shared infrastructure. What had once been an assertive association now operated with caution. That shift rippled through the community. Residents who had grown used to strict enforcement noticed fewer notices on their doors. Fines were explained instead of imposed. Meetings became more transparent, and minutes were published promptly. The board spoke less about authority and more about responsibility. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The road itself became symbolic. Its original path was permanently closed, and the replacement route followed boundaries confirmed through proper easements and oversight. It cost more, took longer, and required compromises, but it was legal, and that mattered now more than speed ever had. From my perspective, the conflict had ended quietly. There were no victory statements, no public confrontations. I continued using my land as before, unaffected by the association's internal changes. The difference was that my rights were no longer questioned or assumed away. Occasionally, I'd hear residents talk about how things used to be, about how the HOA once acted without hesitation. Those conversations always ended the same way. Acknowledgement that the old system hadn't been as solid as it looked. What surprised most people wasn't that the HOA lost authority, it was that nothing collapsed without it. Life went on. In some ways, it improved. The fear of arbitrary enforcement faded. Communication replaced assumption, and the community adjusted. The case never made headlines. It didn't need to. Its impact lived in quieter spaces, in meetings that ended with questions instead of orders, in policies written with care instead of confidence, and in a road that now existed because permission was granted, not because someone assumed it would be. That was the real resolution, not control gained or lost, but balance restored. And just when everything seemed settled, a final reflection made it clear why this outcome mattered far beyond one road. Months later, standing near the boundary line, I realized the road had never been the real issue. It was the mindset behind it. The land was quiet again. No machinery, no temporary signage. Just open ground where shortcuts once existed. From the outside, it looked like nothing had happened. But for those involved, the changes were permanent. The HOA now operated under limits it couldn't ignore. Every land-related decision required verification. Every enforcement action carried a paper trail. The association still existed, still functioned, but its authority was grounded in documentation, not assumption. That difference mattered. What struck me most was how quickly people adapted. Residents adjusted to longer routes without complaint. Emergency services coordinated with properly recorded access points. Deliveries followed the new layout. The inconvenience many feared never materialized. The community learned that legality didn't mean loss, it meant stability. Occasionally, someone would ask why I didn't push harder. Why I didn't demand damages beyond restoration. Why I didn't try to take control outright. The answer was simple. The goal was never domination. It was clarity. Once the boundary was respected, the conflict dissolved on its own. The HOA's leadership changed gradually. New board members came in with different priorities. Legal advisors were consulted early instead of late. Risk assessments replaced shortcuts. The culture shifted from enforcement first to verification first. That change didn't come from punishment, it came from consequence. The road became a reference point in meetings and discussions, not as a warning, but as a reminder. A quiet example of what happens when authority outpaces permission. It reshaped how decisions were framed across the association, even in areas unrelated to land. From my side, the outcome reinforced something I'd always believed. Property rights don't need to be loud to be effective. They just need to be enforced calmly and consistently. When documentation is clear, arguments fade. As I walked back from the boundary that day, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. It felt more like something had been corrected, an imbalance restored without escalation. And that's when it became clear why this story wasn't really about a road at all, but about what happens when assumptions finally meet reality. Looking back now, it's clear that one unapproved decision reshaped an entire system that had gone unquestioned for years. What began as a stretch of asphalt cutting through private land exposed something far larger than a boundary dispute. It revealed how easily authority can drift when no one stops to verify it. The HOA didn't start with bad intentions. They started with certainty. And certainty, when left unchallenged, can be more dangerous than malice. The association still exists today. The neighborhood still functions, but the way decisions are made has permanently changed. Nothing moves forward without confirmation. Nothing is enforced without documentation. The road that once symbolized convenience now represents restraint, and that shift has quietly protected everyone involved. For me, the outcome was never about control or compensation. It was about restoring balance. Property rights don't need theatrics. They need consistency. When those rights are respected, conflict fades naturally. And when they're ignored, even powerful institutions can find themselves unraveling under their own assumptions. Residents learned something too. That oversight isn't weakness. That slower processes can prevent bigger problems. And that just because something has always been done that way doesn't mean it was ever done correctly. The most important lesson, though, was this: systems only work when they're grounded in truth. The moment shortcuts replace clarity, cracks form, and once those cracks are exposed, they can't be ignored. This story didn't end with a dramatic ruling or a public showdown. It ended with something more lasting, a corrected structure that now operates within its limits. Quiet, stable, accountable. And sometimes, that's the most powerful outcome of all. If this story made you think differently about property rights and authority, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video, comment your thoughts below, and share what stood out to you most.